Hello friends, today we would discuss about a very interesting topic, ancient world culture. And just to add up to this, I have added Indian culture's assimilation to Northeast Asia within it. Let's start with that. Whenever we say that if we have to study a Roman Empire, or I'm reading a Greek philosophy and literature, or if you just look at the pyramids of Egypt, these are all accepted parts of a Western education, aren't they? Probably so even today, in the plurality of approaches to the study of history and to the study of cultures, people talk about Plato or Dante or Krishna or Muhammad Sahib, but there's an important provision how you approach ancient culture or any other culture for that matter, and how you conceive of the people of such distant worlds are of paramount importance. At this point, you might ask yourself these two additional questions. Do we study these cultures because to some extent all cultures share certain characteristics? Or does our own culture reflect aspect of all these cultures? The answers to the first of the two questions has historically been found in a discussion of a university. Can you expect that? Consider for a moment the case of Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. You might well ask how the battle that Arjuna holds off while frozen on his chariot relates, for example, to contemporary battles in World War II. Convinced that his relatives will die in this life only to be reborn in another, Arjuna can reluctantly permit the carnage to begin. No such choice is left to Schindler's, who is featured in the Spielberg film, on the other hand, whose intervention on behalf of Jews saved many people in this life. The danger in looking for universals thus consists in reformulating others, possibly alien, views to fit our own. So we must always guard against the assumption that other people think as we do, or they should. Arjuna speaks within the context of one culture, and Schindler's acts within the confines of another. The differences among cultures are of greatest interest here. And reading about ancient culture, believe me, is reading about other people whose lives were surely different from our own. The social organization of Socrates' Athens, where a gimpy-legged man could hobble around interrogating citizens at will, differs profoundly from today's worlds beset with modern media, whereby people rarely get to see or literally hear their critics. How can we today understand the psychology of the thousands of Egyptian workers who apparently unquestioningly spend their lives dragging great blocks of stone across burning sands in the construction of staggering pyramidal edifices whose completion took many lifetimes? Interestingly, these differences may help us better to see and definitely to know the limits of our culture and the limits of our language and experience. The questions comes in our mind that what is the exact meaning of the term culture? Actually, culture is a part of the external influences that impact the consumer in the simple language. The culture represents influences that are imposed on the consumer by other individuals. The definition of culture offered in one textbook is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by person as a member of a society. So in totality, the term culture refers to a state of intellectual development or manners, the social and political forces that influence the growth of a human being is defined as culture. The culture of Asia is the artificial aggregate of the cultural heritage of many nationalities, societies, and ethnic groups in the region. Traditionally called a continent from a Western-centric perspective of Asia. The region or continent is more commonly divided into more natural, geographic, and cultural sub-regions, including the Central Asia, East Asia, South Asia, in which our Indian subcontinent situated, North Asia, West Asia, and Southeast Asia. Geographically, Asia is not a distinct continent. Culturally, there has been little unity or common history for many of the cultures and peoples of Asia. Asian art, music, cuisine, as well as literature are important parts of Asian culture. Eastern philosophy and religion also plays a major role, with Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam all playing major roles. One of the most complex parts of Asian culture is the relationship between traditional culture and the Western world. To begin about the Northeast Asia, I'll say that the East Asia is usually thought to consist of China, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. The dominant influence historically has been China. Though in modern time, cultural exchange has flowed more bidirectionally. Major characteristics of this region include shared Chinese-derived language characteristics as well as shared religion, especially Buddhism and Taoism. There is also a shared social and moral philosophy which is derived from Confucianism too. When we talk about India's cultural past, then India's history and culture, which is ancient, dynamic, spanning back to the beginning of human civilization. It began with a mysterious culture along the Indus River and in farming communities in the southern lands of India. The history of India is one punctuated by constant integration with migrating people and with the diverse culture that surround India. Placed in the center of Asia, history of India is at the crossroads of the culture from China to Europe and the most significant Asian connection with the cultures of Africa. India's history is more than just a set of unique development in a definable process. It is in many ways a microcosm of human history itself, a diversity of cultures all impinging on a great people and being reforged into new syncretic forms. IndianHistory.com and a number of sites, if you just go through that, they just start from ancient history of India to modern Indian history, and then they just start the timeline starting from the 3000 BCs to Indus Valley civilization, Harappan civilizations to 1000 AD to the Chola dynasty of the ancient history of India. Or you just go through any other sources, they will just show you the cultural growth of Indian civilization. The history of India, which begins with the birth of Indus Valley civilization, is found on the sites of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Lothal, and the coming of the Aryans. These two phases are usually described as the pre-Vedic or the Vedic periods. It is in the Vedic period that Hinduism first arose, and this is the time to which the Vedas are dated. In the 5th century, large parts of India were united under King Ashoka. He also converted to Buddhism, and in his reign that Buddhism spread to other parts of Asia. It is in the reign of the Mauryas that Hinduism took the shape and fundamentally informs the religion down to the present day. Successor states were more fragmented. Apart from the unifying influence of Confucianism, Buddhism, Chinese characters and other Chinese cultural influences, there is nevertheless much diversities between the countries of the region, such as different religion, national costumes, languages, writing systems, cuisine, traditional music, and so on. Let's cover the ancient cultures of the world. And to begin with, the best is our own Indian culture, which is rich, diverse, and as a result unique in its own way. The rich heritage of Indian culture can be traced back to the ancient time. The practices, the beliefs, customs that we follow today are established thousands of years back. In ancient India, culture was a determining factor of the Indian society, though different beliefs were followed in different regions. The foundation base of ancient Indian culture remained the same. From everyday dressing to elaborate rituals, every minute and major detail was decided centuries back. The root of Indian culture has existed since ancient time, and that is what makes it so strong. After the initial setup of the foundation by the Indus Valley civilization, the coming of the Aryans further consolidated it. The Aryans had a particular social structure according to which administration was carried out. There was division of labor and each hierarchy has its own job to do. The merchants and the priestly class were considered very elite and were much respected and feared. There were certain symbols of worships like cows, bulls, and sacrificial fire, etc. The chanting of the sacred hymns came into vogue with the Vedic age. Though agriculture was the main occupation, there was development of small-scale industries and handicraft. Buddhism was born in India within the culture of Hinduism and then charted its own path. Like Hinduism, it questioned the reality of this earthly world and speculated on the existence of other worlds. Unlike Hinduism, however, Buddhism had a founder, a set of originating scriptures, and an order of monks. Buddhism renounced hereditary caste organization and the supremacy of the Brahmin priest. It spread to Southeast Asia along with Hinduism, but Buddhism became more popular, gaining acceptance as the principal religion of Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam until today. It won multitudes of adherents throughout the rest of Asia as well, in Sri Lanka, Tibet, China, Korea, Japan. Yet in India itself, Buddhism lost out in competition with Hinduism and its priesthood, virtually vanishing from the subcontinent by about the 12th century. When we talk about the culture of China, which is the home to one of the world's oldest and most complex civilization, covering a history of about 5,000 years, many ethnic groups have existed in China. In terms of the number, however, the top ethnic group is the Han Chinese. Throughout history, many groups have been assimilated into neighboring ethnicities or disappeared without a trace. Traditional Chinese culture, it covers a large geographical territories. Each region is usually divided into distinct subculture. Different periods of history have different names for the various positions within society. Conceptually, each imperial or feudal periods are similar, with the government and the military officials ranking high in the hierarchy and the rest of the population under regular Chinese law. Spoken Chinese has consisted of a number of Chinese dialects and languages throughout history. Chinese language is very difficult to study. Different forms of art have swayed under the influence of great philosophers, teachers, religious figures, and even political figures too. Chinese art encompasses all facets of fine art, folk art, performance art. Let's cover some major cultures of Neolithic China to understand this history of China in great detail. Let's begin with the first Neolithic culture which was discovered in China. It was Yangshu culture. The timeline is 5000 to 3000 BC. It finds stretched from the Yellow River plain in the east into the Gansu in the west. All ceramics are of reddish color and painted with various black designs, geometric patterns, but also figures of animals. the Yangshuo peoples made use of shaman chief that was buried, flanked by dragon and tiger figures formed with clam shells. Very famous are the findings of Yangshuo village of Banpo near Xi'an. It is east to the Yangshuo communities. The Davenkao culture, the other one, the timeline is 5000 to 3000 BC. It was located in modern Shandong. A distinctive feature of the Davenkao culture is the rich grave furnishing that were added to the tombs of chiefs. Their coffins were buried in a small pit that was located at the bottom of a larger pit, a grave-like type structure that was inherited by the Shang culture. Although the cultures in the central plain played a very important role, the prehistoric cultures of other regions were also developing simultaneously with their own characteristic features, as is increasingly proven by archaeological finds. Influence between these different cultures of prehistoric China was always mutual and in no way one directional. During the 4th millennium BC, there occurred a spread of certain ceramic and handicraft style that become increasingly common in all different cultural regions: Ding, Dao, rectangular, semi-lunar knives, and during the 2nd millennium, bronze castings too. Only when a great part of these prehistoric culture exhibited increasing similarities around 3000 BC, it should be allowed to speak of one China and a Chinese mega civilization. Let's cover a few things about how did India supported or played a big role in influencing the religion in China. During the 3rd century BC, Emperor Ashoka sent missionaries to the northwest of India, that is present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. The mission achieved great success as the region soon became a center of Buddhist learning with many distinguished monks and scholars. When the merchants of Central Asia came into this region for trade, they learnt about Buddhism and accepted it as their religion. With the support of these merchants, many cave monasteries were established along the trade routes across Central Asia. By the 2nd century BC, some Central Asian cities like Khotan near already become important center for Buddhism. The Chinese people had their first contact with Buddhism through the Central Asian who were already Buddhist. When the Han Dynasty of China extended its power to Central Asia in the 1st century BC, trade and cultural ties between China and Central Asia also increased. In this way, the Chinese people learnt about Buddhism so that by the middle of the 1st century CE, a community of Chinese Buddhists was already in existence. As interest in Buddhism grew, there was a great demand for Buddhist texts to be translated from Indian languages into Chinese. And this led to the arrival of translators from Central Asia and India. The first notable one was An Shigao from Central Asia, who came to China in the middle of the 2nd century. With a growing collection of Chinese translation of Buddhist texts, Buddhism became more widely known and a Chinese monastic order was also formed. The first known Chinese monk was said to be An Shigao's disciple. The earliest translator had some difficulty in finding the exact words to explain Buddhist concept in Chinese, so they made use of Taoist terms in their translation. As a result, people began to relate Buddhism with the existing Taoist tradition. It was only later on that the Chinese came to understand fully the teachings of Buddha. After the fall of the Han Dynasty in the early part of the 3rd century, China faced a period of political disunity. Despite the war and unrest, the translation of Buddhist texts continued. During this time, Buddhism gained popularity with the Chinese people. Both foreign and Chinese monks were actively involved in establishing monasteries and lecturing on Buddhist teaching. Among the Chinese monks, Dao An, who lived in the 4th century, was the most outstanding. Though he had to move from place to place because of political strife, he not only wrote and lectured extensively but also collected copies of the translated scriptures and prepared the first catalogue of them. He invited the famous translator Kumarajiva from Kucha. With the help of Daoyen's disciples, Kumarajiva translated a large number of important texts and revised the earlier Chinese translation. His fine translations were popular and helped to spread Buddhism in China. Many of his translations are still in use to this day, and because of political unrest, Kumarajiva's disciples were later dispersed, and this helped to spread Buddhism to other parts of China. Let's talk about the establishment of Buddhism in China. To begin with, from the beginning of the 5th century to around the end of the 6th century, northern and southern China came under separate rulers. The south remained under native dynasties while non-Chinese ruler controlled the north part. The Buddhists in southern China continued to translate Buddhist texts and to lecture and write commentaries on the major text. The rulers were devoted Buddhists who saw to the construction of numerous temples, participated in Buddhist ceremonies, and organized public talks on Buddhism. One of the rulers expanded on the earlier catalogue of Buddhist texts. In northern China, except for 2 short periods of persecution, Buddhism flourished under the lavish royal patronage of rulers who favored the religion. By the later half of the 6th century, monks were even employed in government posts. During this period, Buddhist art flourished, especially in the caves at Dunhuang, Yungang and Longmen. In the Thousands Cave of Dunhuang, Buddhist paintings covered the walls and there were thousands of Buddha statues in these caves. At Yungang and Longmen, many Buddha images of varying sizes were carved out of the rocks. All these activities were a sign of the firm establishment of Buddhism in China by the end of this period. With the rise of the Tang dynasty at the beginning of the 7th century, Buddhism reached out to more and more people. It soon became an important part of Chinese culture and it had great influence on Chinese art, literature, sculpture, architecture, and philosophy of that time. By then, the number of Chinese translations of Buddhist texts had increased tremendously. The Buddhists were now faced with the problem of how to study this large number of Buddhist texts and how to put their teachings into practice. As a result, a number of schools of Buddhism arose, with each school concentrating on certain texts for their study and practice. The Tiantai school, for instance, developed a system of teachings and practice based on the Lotus Sutra. It also arranged all the Buddhist texts into graded categories to suit the varying aptitude of the followers. Other schools arose which focused on different areas of Buddhist teachings and practice. The 2 most prominent schools were the Chan and the Pure Land school. The Chan school emphasized the practice of meditation as a direct way of gaining insight and experiencing enlightenment in this very life. The Chan school of Buddhism is said to have been introduced to China by Bodhidharma, who came from India at the beginning of the 6th century. He was, like many early missionaries, not only well versed in Buddhist teaching but also proficient in meditation. However, during his lifetime, he was not very well known as he secluded himself in a mountain temple. Later, through the efforts of his successors, this school became one of the most important of the Chinese school of Buddhist practice. The Pure Land school centers its practice on the recitation of the name of Amitabha Buddha. The practice is based on the sermon which teaches that people could be reborn in the Western paradise, that's called Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha, if they recite his name and have sincere faith in him. Once in Pure Land, the Buddhists are said to be able to achieve enlightenment more easily. Because of the simplicity of its practice, the school became popular, especially among the masses throughout China. A very famous pilgrimage of a very important personality from China, Xuanzang, to India. Let's cover that also here. To understand this topic clearly, during the 6th and the 7th century, when the various Chinese schools of Buddhism were being developed, there were more monks than before making pilgrimage to India to study the Buddhist scriptures here. Among the most famous of these pilgrims was Xuanzang, who travelled overland to India. His journey was extremely difficult as he had to cross high mountains, desert, and confronted by bandits also. He studied at the well-known monastic university at Nalanda and later travelled widely throughout India. On his return to China, he brought back a large collection of Buddhist texts which he translated during the remaining years of his life. Because of his profound understanding of Buddhism and his excellent skill in languages, his translation marked a new period in Buddhist literature. His travel records gives detailed description of Central Asia and India and provides an eyewitness account of these regions during his time. When we talk about the further development of Buddhism in China, we have to start it from the middle of the 9th century, when Buddhism faced persecution by a Taoist emperor. He decreed the demolition of monasteries, confiscation of temples' land, return of monks and nuns to secular life, and the melting of metal Buddha's images. Although the persecution lasted only for a short time, it marked an end of an era for Buddhism in China. Following the demolition of monasteries and the dispersal of the scholarly monks, a number of Chinese schools of Buddhism, including the Tiantai school, ceased to exist as separate movement. They were absorbed into the Chan and the Pure Land school, which survived. The eventual result was the emergence of a new form of Chinese Buddhist practice in the monastery. Besides practicing Chan meditation, Buddhists also recited the name of Amitabha Buddha and studied Buddhist texts. It is this form of Buddhism which has survived to the present time. Just as all the Buddhist teachings and practice were combined under one roof in the monasteries, the Buddhist lay followers also began to practice Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism simultaneously. Gradually, however, Confucian teachings became dominant in the court among the officials who were not in favor of Buddhism. Buddhism generally continued to be a major influence in Chinese religious life. In the earlier part of the 20th century, there was an attempt to modernize and reform the tradition in order to attract wider support. One of the most well-known reformists was Taizhu, a monk noted for his Buddhist scholarship. Besides introducing many reforms in the monastic community, he also introduced Western-styled education, which included the study of secular subjects and foreign languages for Buddhists. In the 1960s, under the People's Republic, Buddhism was suppressed, many monasteries were closed, monks and nuns returned to lay life, and in recent years, a more liberal policy regarding religion has led to a growth of interest in the practice of Buddhism. The Chinese script is the oldest continuously used writing system in the world, as we all know, and has long been a unifying principle of East Asia as a medium for conveying Chinese culture. It was historically used throughout the region and still used by the ethnic Chinese throughout the world, as well as in Japan and to a lesser extent South Korea. Within China, the meaning of the characters remain generally unchanged from region to region, though their pronunciation differ. This is because classical Chinese was long the written language of all China and was replaced by Mandarin as a national written language in the 20th century. For example, a Cantonese and a Mandarin speaker cannot hold a conversation, but if they are educated, they can understand each other in writing, as they both learn to read and write Mandarin in school. To a lesser extent, Taiwanese, South Koreans, Japanese can all understand something of the Chinese character that the other writes, though this is no longer the case with China due to simplification of the characters there. Chinese writing was passed on to Korea, Japan and Vietnam. In Japan, where it is called kanji in Japan, now forms a major component of the Japanese writing system. In the 9th century, Japanese developed their own writing system called kana, hiragana and the katakana, which support kanji script to suit Japanese language. Today, both ideograph kanji and syllabary kana is used in mixture in Japanese. In Vietnam, Chinese script was used during the millennium under the influence of China, with the vernacular Chu Nom script are also used since 13th century. However, this has now been replaced completely by the Latin alphabet based Quoc Nu. In the 15th century, Koreans also developed their own writing system called Hangul, which is more adapted script to write Korean. In all these cultures, especially in China and Japan, the education level of a person is traditionally measured by the quality of his or her calligraphy rather than diction, and sometimes the case as there in the West. Though Korea and Japan are not Chinese speaking region, their language have been influenced by Chinese to some extent, even though their writing system have changed over time. Chinese is still found in the historical roots of many borrowed words, though in modern time it is also influenced by other Asian languages, especially modern technical and political terms created in Japan to represent Western concept. Let's cover the another nation which is a part of Northeast Asia, Korea, which is a very strong partner of India in Northeast Asia. Geographical location of Korea also makes it very good partner for India. Northeast Asia is bounded by Asian mainland and the chain of islands that stretches from Sakhalin and Japan to Taiwan and even to the Malaysian peninsula. South Korea's geographical position is located in the center of this area. So looked at from this perspective, Korea's central location gives us the central role to play as a balancer and connector in the region. From this perspective also, Korea can be important factor for India. Korea can serve as a host for India in this region, helping India understand this region closely and become a part of this fast growing region in the world. Let's cover certain aspect how religion called Buddhism was introduced there in Korea. The earliest historical records state that there were 3 kingdoms in Korea, namely Koguru in the north, Pakashis in the southwest and Silla in the southeast. According to a tradition, a Chinese monk in the second half of the 4th century first introduced Buddhism to the northern kingdom of Koguryu. A Central Asian monk is said to have brought Buddhism to Pakashis sometime later. The Silla kingdom was a most isolated region and was at first not ready to accept Buddhism. The people held firmly to their traditional religious belief. There was such strong opposition to Buddhism that a monk who went there to spread the Buddha's teaching is said to have been killed. Eventually, by the middle of the 6th century, even the Silla people accepted Buddhism. Let's cover those aspects which proves that how this religion Buddhism got spread out to the other parts of Korea. During the 6th and the 7th centuries, many Korean monks went to China to study and brought back with them the teachings of various Chinese schools of Buddhism. Towards the end of 7th century, the 3 kingdoms were unified under the powerful Silla rulers. From then onwards, Buddhism flourished under their royal patronage. Great works of art were created and magnificent monasteries built. Buddhism exerted great influence on the life of the Korean people. In the 10th century, Silla rule ended with the founding of the Koryo dynasty. Under this new rule, Buddhism reached the height of its importance. With royal support, more monasteries were built and more works of art was being produced. The whole of the Tripitaka in Chinese translation was also carved onto the wooden printing blocks. Thousands of these blocks were made in the 13th century and have been carefully preserved to the present day as part of Korea's national treasures. But along with this followed a period of suppression of Buddhism in Korea. Under the new rule of the Yi dynasty from the end of the 14th century to the early 20th century, Buddhism lost the support of the court when Confucianism became the sole official religion of the state. Measures were taken to suppress the activities of the Buddhist community. Buddhist monks were forbidden to enter the capital. Their lands were confiscated. Monasteries were being closed down. Buddhist ceremonies abolished. Despite all the troubles of this difficult period, there were occasionally some great monks who continued to inspire their followers and kept Buddhism alive. Later on, the revival of Buddhism started in Korea. With the collapse of the Yi dynasty, Korea came under Japanese control. The Japanese who came to Korea introduced their own forms of Buddhism, which included the tradition of the married clergy. As a result, some monks in Korea broke away from the tradition of celibacy. From this period onwards, there was a revival of Buddhism in Korea. Many Buddhists in Korea have since been actively involved in promoting education and missionary activities. They have founded universities, set up schools in many parts of Korea, and established youth groups and lay organization. Buddhist texts, originally in Chinese translation, are now being retranslated into modern Korean. New monasteries are being built and old ones repaired. So today, Buddhism is again playing an important role in the life of the Korean people. It is said that Korea's historical role of harmony is very important between various religions and philosophical streams. Today, there exists a large number of religious and philosophical streams in Northeast Asia. Different religions and spiritual beliefs have been the major cause of discord and disharmony between different countries. Modern Korea serves as a special exception in this regard. It is the only country in the region with a truly multi-religious nature and scope. All major religions of the world, whether you talk about Christianity, Buddhism, Islam or many other religions, they all flourish here. This is very simple or very similar to India, where major religions of the world coexist side by side. First of all, Korea enjoys a unique historical position similar to India. In its recorded history of more than 5,000 years, it has never tried to conquer another land nor hurt any peoples. So unlike Japan and China, who have long histories of aggression, Korea has very high moral historical credential. This peaceful history is similar to India's, which has also never attacked another country. Both countries have remained pacifist throughout their histories. Koreans and Indians are also closer on philosophical and spiritual levels. There is unity and harmony of minds between Indian and Korean people. India doesn't share this kind of philosophical and spiritual closeness with any other country in this region. As such, it will be much easier for India to have Korea's support and understanding. Historical and cultural relations between these two countries make the future of India and Korea relations very, very promising in the future. According to Korean historical record, a princess from Ayodhya came to Korea and married to Kim Suro in 48 AD. Both countries also have very deep religious connection. The Indian monk Marananth brought Buddhism to Pakistan in 384 AD. Exchanges in arts, costumes, musical skills, instruments, architecture have been shared most between the two countries. In modern times also, India also had a very strong connection with Korea since its independence from Japanese rule. In 1947, India was chairman of UN Commission to hold elections in Korea. After the Korean War, India was chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriations Commission, which played a very important role in repatriating prisoners of war of both North and South Korea. India also organized a 3,000 strong Indian custodial force to safeguard 23,000 prisoners of war and their repatriations. India doesn't have this kind of strong connection with any other country in this region. So there exists strong base for building an alliance with Korea. So because of the influence of Buddhism and the positive role played by India during the Korean War, there is an affection for India among Korean people. So it will be much easier for India to build an alliance with Korea than any other country in this region. Both Korea and India share many values and beliefs. Both are political democracies, share a common vision for Asia and the world. Both share an interest in laws and the norms governing international order instead of the power dominant order being pushed by some. After Korea, let's cover the role played by Japan in the northeastern part of the world and in particularly Asia. Let's cover the aspect of Buddhism, how it was introduced in this country. Way back in the 6th century, the king of Pakish, anxious to establish peaceful relations with Japan, sent gifts of images of Buddhas and copies of Buddhist texts to the Japanese imperial court. Buddhism was recommended as a means of bringing great benefit to the country. The Japanese people soon accommodated Buddhism along with their indigenous Shinto beliefs. Being a religion of universal appeal, Buddhism helped to foster harmony within the country. From the very beginning, the establishment of Buddhism depended on the protection and support of the Japanese ruler. Among these, Prince Shotoku deserves special mention for his great contribution to the early growth and expansion of Buddhism in Japan during the early part of the 7th century. Tradition says that Prince Shotoku wrote the first constitution of Japan, which promoted moral and social values as taught in Buddhism. His devotion and royal patronage of Buddhism helped to make it widely known. Many Buddhist temples were built and works of art created. Monks were also being sent to China to study. Besides encouraging Japanese monks to read the scripture, Prince Shotoku lectured and later wrote commentaries on some of these scriptures. And his commentaries are said to be the first ever written in Japan and are now kept as national treasures. As we just cover the dynasty period in Japan, let's begin with the first one, the Nara period. The 8th century in Japan is known as Nara period. During this period, Buddhism continued to spread as more new temples were built in all the provinces, the most famous being the Todaji temple at Nara. Buddhist scriptures were copied and distributed throughout the country. It was also during this time that Chinese monks started to arrive and many Chinese schools of Buddhism were introduced to Japan. The Japanese monks not only studied and practiced the Buddhist teaching, but also became involved in administrative roles. Some of them served as scribes and clerks in the court, while others helped in carrying out the public works. A few were assigned to explore and draw maps of distant parts of the country. Though the monastic order grew in size, it remained firmly under the control of the court, as the ordination of monks was only permitted at a few centers approved by the court. The second era which supported Buddhism was the Heian period. Heian period began towards the end of the 8th century when the capital was established at the Heian, present-day Kyoto. During this period, two Japanese monks named Sashos and Kukai brought two schools of Buddhism to Japan from China. Sashos had a temple on Mount Hai, which was near the new capital. Soon the ruler began to patronize the temple and also send Saisho to study in China. On his return to Japan, Saisho introduced the Tiantai school of Buddhism from China. However, he later combined several schools of Buddhism into one comprehensive system. At his temple on Mount Hai, monks had to undergo a 12-year course of study and meditation. Some of those who completed their training stayed on the mountain, while others left to serve the state in various administrative posts. The Tiantai school of Buddhism soon flourished, and at the height of its development, there were 3,000 buildings on Mount Hai and 30,000 monks. Its influence on the development of Buddhism in Japan continued to be felt even a few centuries later. At about the same time, the other monk, Kukai, returned from China and introduced Vajrayana Buddhism to Japan. This school of Buddhism became very popular with the Japanese court, and its influence was even greater than that of the Tiantai school of Buddhism. Kukai himself was a learned monk and wrote a great deal on the teachings of this school. Next in this category of the school which supported Buddhism in Japan is the Kamakura period. At the end of the 12th century, political power shifted to a group of warriors who are popularly known as samurais, who had their headquarters at Kamakura. During this period, a number of distinctly Japanese Buddhist sects arose. They became popular because of their simplicity and directness of approach. And among these sects were the Zodo Shinshu, Nichiren, and the Zen. There were some parts of that. Let's cover that one after the other. The first one is the Zodo Shinshu. The Zodo Shinshu were founded by Shinran, who studied at Mount Hiei. His master, Honen, taught that the practice of reciting the name of Amitabh would be sufficient for his followers to be reborn in the Western paradise. However, the other monks on Mount Hiei objected to his teaching. As a result, Honen and his disciples were forced into exile. Shinran was one of the disciples who accompanied Honen into exile. Shinran's teaching was a modification of his master. He taught that one need only to have faith in Amitabh to be reborn in the Western paradise. According to Shinran, it was not even necessary to recite Amitabh's name also. Shinran later got married, and in this way started the tradition of the married clergy in Japan, which was some way unique within itself. Those who follow this tradition continue to live in temples and conduct religious services while leading a family life. The second subdivision is the Nichiren sect. The Nichiren sect was founded by Nichiren, who studied at Mount Hishi but was not satisfied with the traditional Buddhist practices taught there. He later left Mount Hiei and travelled widely before returning to his native district. Nichiren felt that the truth of Buddhism was to be found in the Lotus Sutra. He taught that reciting the formula, homage to the Lotus Sutra, is the only means of attaining enlightenment. As he was intolerant to other Buddhist sects and vigorously denounced them, he was later sent into exile. In his later years, he was pardoned and allowed to return. After his death, his followers spread his teaching throughout the country, and it soon gained popularity. Next sect was the Zen sect, which is actually a Japanese version of the Chan school of Buddhism. It gained popularity among the warriors because of its emphasis on strict discipline of the mind and body. Zen teaching also influenced the development of tea ceremony, black ink painting, the art of flower arrangement, and the No drama, which consisted of dances and recitation of the poems. What happened in between the 16th and to the 19th century in context of Buddhism in Japan? Let's cover certain important developments. From the 16th century, Buddhism lost favor with the military rulers who feared the rising power and influence of Buddhist religious guru in Japan. Some important Buddhist centers were even destroyed by these rulers. In the next 3 centuries, Buddhism came under the close supervision of the military dictatorship, which had strict control over all areas of life. The traditions of the various sects were, however, maintained. The temples also continued to play an active role in the fields of education and social service. In the middle of the 19th century, the Japanese emperor took control of the government. He did not support Buddhism. In fact, many Buddhist temples were demolished and valuable Buddha image sculptures burnt. The Buddhists in Japan responded by modernizing their organization. Schools, universities were established. Buddhist monks were given a modern education. What is happening in the present century? Actually, since the Second World War, Japan has seen the rise of many religious gurus, which are modification of the older established sect. Nichiren Soshu, for example, grew out of the Nichiren sect of the Kamakura period, which lay members of these newer religious groups play a prominent role in promoting Buddhist culture and education. At the same time, the older sect continue to exist and still attract support both inside and outside Japan. The shared characteristics of East Asian countries, including China, South Korea and Japan, provide a basis for establishing a common cultural community, expert says. These characteristics include Confucianism, Buddhism, written Chinese character as a communication tool, treating humans as a part of nature, the emphasis on the community over the individual, and the realization of harmony from contradiction. How can we forget a very small country but very important one, Tibet? And along with that, I'll just try to cover Mongolian Buddhism, which is popular